In these weeks leading up to Easter as a church, we're focusing on Luke's account of Jesus' trial and his crucifixion, all leading up then to the celebration of Jesus' resurrection on Easter Sunday. Throughout history, many Christians, many churches have taken this season leading up to Easter as a time of personal reflection on Jesus' death and a time of preparation for the meaning of Good Friday and for Easter. In fact, some of you may hear, sometimes churches will talk about a season of Lent, and that's kind of this idea, this 40-day period leading up to that. And we don't always do that every year as a church, but this year, I really prayed about it. I felt that God was calling me to do this and to lead you kind of in this time of reflection and preparation. And I want to tell you, many of us look at this and we say, we know the story, and even if you know the story, I want to tell you there's a tremendous amount that we can learn as we dig deeper into God's Word. And not only about the events and what happened, but it's very practical, things that we can learn and apply to our own lives. So this morning we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 22, verses 54 to 71, which is the story of the first part of Jesus' trial, including the story of Peter's denial of Jesus. And I know we're saying we're going to start in 54. I'm actually going to start in verse 53. But I do encourage you, if you have a Bible, to open it up to Luke 22 and to leave it open throughout our time so you could follow along from the scripture throughout the message. But let me begin by reading the passage we're looking at, Luke 22, starting in verse 53. Jesus said, "When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." And then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down amongst them. And then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light, looking closely at him, said, "This man was also with him." But he denied it, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval, about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you're talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. And when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led him away to their council. And they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." And then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." May God bless the reading of his word. Let me pray. Father, thank you for the privilege that we do have to come together this morning, Father, to be able to dive into the truth of your word. I thank you for the things that you continue to teach me through my own study. And Father, I pray that you would now use me, that you would speak through me and in spite of me, Father, to help communicate not my ideas, not my opinions, but somehow you'd use me to communicate your truth. And Father, help each one of us to have hearts that are open to hear and not only understand, but to apply whatever you would speak to us this morning. Father, I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, when we watch that video in the beginning, and then as we read this passage that we just read, one of the things that I think becomes immediately obvious is that this whole scene is defined by kind of this overwhelming sense of darkness. In fact, if we think of all of Luke 22, from the time that Jesus is having the Last Supper with his disciples, to the betrayal of Judas, to the trial before the religious leaders, to Peter's denial of Jesus, all of them happened at night. We often refer to this as the night that Jesus was betrayed. So there's a theme of darkness that's overwhelming throughout this whole passage. In fact, if you look at verses 52 and 53, as the religious leaders come to arrest Jesus, led by Judas, who betrays him with a kiss, Jesus responds to them, and look what he says. And he says, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. So even Jesus himself explicitly draws out this theme of darkness. But when he says it's the hour, the power of darkness, what does that mean? What is he talking about here? You see, when we read it, it sounds kind of like an odd statement, and it does. And part of that is because it's actually saying something that has multi-levels of dimension of truth to them. And so we read it in the translation we use, the English Standard Version, and it says, this is your hour, the power of darkness. And so part of it is he's speaking to the religious leaders. This is your hour. This is what you've been working towards. But even beyond that, he's talking about, okay, this is also an hour that darkness reigns. And so it literally could be translated, this is the hour, the authority of darkness. It's the hour of the religious leaders, of their agenda, but also, in fact, I like the way the New Living Translation reads it. This is your moment, the time when the power of darkness reigns. Again, it's not all just that the religious leaders were doing this all at night. It's not that they were just trying to hide their activities from the many in the crowd that loved Jesus. But it was also that their actions were driven by the dominion of darkness. They were blind to the truth. And it was a time that it appeared that the forces that were opposed to Jesus were in control. The darkness was in control. But let me ask you this. If it says it's the time when the power of darkness reigns, does that mean that God was not reigning? That in this time that God wasn't in control? Oh, from all human perspectives, it definitely appeared to be that. It appeared to be that the followers of Jesus were, and Jesus himself, were now the victims of evil forces. But the big question that we have to ask when we look at this is, when we look at what it's saying here, is this the hour of darkness when God is out of control? When darkness is reigning, or is it a period where it appears that darkness is in control, but in reality, God is still sovereign? You see, it's a huge question, not only in understanding this passage, but it's huge in understanding the periods of difficulty and trial that we're going to go through in our own lives. There are going to be times in our lives, and many of us have gone through that, where it appears that evil is winning. We can't sense and see God's presence. There's times where it looks like darkness and evil is in control. But is that just something that appears to be the case, or is it really the case? Or is it appears and God in reality is still in charge? He's still working out his plan, but in unseen and unexpected ways. You see, the fact is that all of us are going to face circumstances and times when it feels like darkness is in control, and it feels as if God is out of control. There are going to be times that we are doing what's right, and yet it seems as if we're suffering. And it looks like those who are doing wrong are prospering, and that it doesn't seem right. There are going to be times where it feels like that the lie is winning and the truth is lost, where it feels like God has lost control, and when the time of the power of darkness reigns. Have you gone through that? You see, it's one thing to go through times that you realize that you're not in control. Well, we've all gone through that. We realize that I don't control things, and some of those are times that God tries to drag me back to trust in him. I don't control this, so I've got to rely on God because he's in charge. But what about those times where you feel like, I'm not even sure God's in charge? What about those times that you're doing what's right, and you pray and you really believe this is what God wants, and you pray and God doesn't answer? God, are you there? Are you hearing my prayer? Or maybe you've been through a time where you're trying to do what's right, and meanwhile you have a friend or a coworker or a neighbor who just is disregarding God and his life with every aspect. And you look back and it seems like you're not being rewarded, but they're prospering. In fact, sometimes they may be prospering at your expense. They're harming you, and there's no justice, and you're saying, God, this isn't right. God, if you are really in charge, won't you reward faithfulness? Won't you establish justice? But it seems like evil is winning. Or perhaps you've been through a time where you've had a crisis, and man, it's an incredible crisis, or a series of crises that drag on longer than you could have ever dreamed. And you pray for God's peace and understanding, but yet it doesn't seem to be there. It feels like God is not in control. I want to tell you, if there was ever a time in human history where it looked as if God had truly lost control, it was that last night of Jesus' life. Even Jesus said it was a time when the power of darkness reigns. And again, no one felt that more than the disciples. So what do we do when it seems like God is out of control? Well, let's look at the story, and we see in the disciples kind of that initial response, our natural response when it seems like God isn't in control. Remember, the disciples had been with Jesus for 3 years. They had stayed with him faithfully, not only in the good times when they had lots of crowds, but even in the hard times when there was opposition, when many who were following actually left him. They believed that he was the Messiah. They had incredible hope. And yet, in the midst of that, there was an instinctive confidence that, okay, no matter what happens, we're going to stay faithful. I mean, let's see this especially in Peter. Here you have the Last Supper with the disciples, and Jesus predicts that one of the disciples would betray him. And at that point, Peter steps up and he makes these incredibly brave boasts. It's like, okay, Jesus, it might be someone else, but it's not me. I would never do that. And then Jesus rebukes and challenges Peter in verses 31 and 32. And this is what he says. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat. But I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, strengthen your brothers. Now, this first take, I want to show 4 things, that Jesus is actually saying 4 things. Number 1, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. He wants to come. He wants to attack you. He wants to have you. He wants to destroy you. And I've prayed that your faith may not fail. Now, in that, it's faith. But in the third thing, what you want to say, Simon, so when you have repented and turned to me again. Now, that's implying something. It means I'm praying your faith won't fail, but you will. Why? Because if you have to repent and turn back, it's going to be because you turned away. And so you're going to fall. And the fourth thing is, and when you come back, I want you to strengthen your brothers. I'm going to redeem your failure so that your story of failure can be used to help strengthen other people. Now, we're going to look at that again in a few moments, but I want you to see that Jesus gives a pretty stark warning. And what is Peter's response? I mean, his response is, no, Jesus, you don't understand. The other guys might fail, but I won't. I want to let you know, I would go with you to prison, to death, no matter what. Now think about it. What if Peter had responded not with pride, but with humility? What if he said, Jesus, really? Man, I'm going to do that? I have that in me. If that's true, help me. What do you want me to do? I mean, if he would have responded with humility, I think there would have been hope, but that's not the way he responded. He responded with an instinctive pride, self-confidence. Jesus, you got the wrong guy. That's not me. So then in verse 34, he says, okay, let's be specific. You're so filled with self-confidence, you don't even know your own weakness. And to prove it, I want to know that before this evening is done, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times that you even know me. You think you're so committed, so strong. I want to tell you, you're going to deny me 3 times. If it was just once, you could argue, say it wasn't really me, it was a slip. But you're going to do it 3 times so that you're going to know how weak you really are. Now, in this, we're going to look a couple times at Peter here, and one of the dangers is when we study this passage, it's easy to look at it and define Peter's sin very narrowly. Well, he denied Jesus, and that means that denying that you know him. If somebody asks you if you're a Christian, to say no, and many of us, we live in a country where we don't face persecution. We may not struggle with that. I want you to see something here, something we'll see later about the root of Peter's sin. One is that the root of his sin was pride and overconfidence. He thinks that he can thump his chest, says, Jesus, no, you don't understand. I will never do that. And in reality, what he needed to realize is that in his self-confidence, he never admitted his own weakness. Because he was so strong in his faith, he never needed to make himself dependent on God's strength. He didn't hear the warning of Jesus and saying, oh, Jesus, how do you strengthen me? In fact, last week, for those that were with us, we saw Jesus' prayer in the garden, and we saw before and after the prayer, Jesus told his disciples twice, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Okay, you're about to get whopped by what's going to happen here, and don't be self-confident. You need God's help. But they were too confident in their strength. And when things got bad, when it looked like darkness was really reigning, they ultimately failed, as we do when we go out in our own strength as well. And even though before we're too tough on Peter, you realize that he actually had a lot of strength. We often look at this and says, oh, when he was tempted a little bit. No, think about Peter's story. Okay, here he's enjoying this incredible evening with Jesus, and then suddenly there's a crowd of armed guards that show up to arrest him. And beyond that, it's led by one of his friends, Judas. And Judas then comes and betrays Jesus. And within minutes, Jesus led off. And all the other disciples, run away in fear. And it's only Peter and John. They had incredible bravery that they're the only ones that then followed Jesus to the trial. All the other disciples had run away and were hiding. But after sneaking into the trial, Peter finds himself in incredibly hostile ground. Everyone else there was part of the group that came to arrest Jesus. They all hate Jesus. And Peter's watching this trial. He's seeing Jesus being mocked. He's seeing being beaten. And we often look at Peter and say, man, I can't believe how weak he was. Would we have done any better in that setting? Even to understand the scene a little bit more, what happened is in that day, the large houses would have rooms that would be built on the outside, and they would have a large courtyard in the middle. And that's where people would gather, and they would have, if they had, big events or things like that, groups of people that would come and meet. And especially large ones, they had the courtyard, and then they had like a little kind of like a solarium inside that. And so the trial was probably inside the solarium, and Peter and all the other guards were in that courtyard, and they could see what's happening. And as they're watching this, Peter comes and he sits around the fire with all these other guards, all these people that had come to arrest Jesus. And somebody recognizes him and challenges him, and he denies that he knows Jesus. And someone else recognizes it, and he denies. And then we're told the third time he's challenged. And we're told in verse 59, after an interval about an hour, still another insisted, saying, certainly this man was also with him, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And as soon as he speaks that third denial, immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So now here's what happens. So he denies, and immediately the rooster crows, and then Jesus looks at him. He turns, and Jesus, who had been beaten, who's now scarred, who's bruised, looks Peter in the eye. And the question I want to ask you, if you could imagine that scene, when Jesus looked Peter in the eye, what did Peter see? What did Peter see in Jesus' eyes? Was it anger? Peter, I can't believe this. Was it rejection? You rejected me, I'm going to reject you. Was it disappointment? What did he see? That's a really important question because it plays into mind what we think we see from Jesus when we fail. I'm going to come back to that question at the end, but be thinking about it. But we have to realize that in that scene, everything that was going around was screaming that Jesus had lost control, that he was now the victim of evil forces. He was about to be condemned and defeated. And how could Peter believe that Jesus would take care of him when Jesus can't take care of himself? But let's dig deeper into the story. Because what we said in the beginning, the question is darkness in control or does it look like it? And what I want you to see is that God was sovereign even in this time of darkness. And the story makes it clear. At first read, it may look like it's darkness is reigning, but it actually is pointing us to the place that, no, God is in control. So what we're going to see is that while evil seems to be winning, God is in control. Look at verse 36 or 63, first of all. We read, and the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They blindfolded him and kept asking, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. And what it looks like here is that God is weak. It looks as if evil is prevailing. Because we may read this and we could say, I can see that evil's prevailing, but how do you say God is in control here? What in this whole scene makes you think that God's in charge? And here's what we need to do, is we need to see this scene in context of another scene earlier in the Gospel of Luke. Happened probably about a week beforehand. You see, what they're doing is they're blindfolding him, and as they're blindfolding him, they're smacking him, hitting him, and they're saying, if you're a prophet, tell us who's hitting you. And the irony of it all is when you look at what Jesus said earlier, they were attacking his prophetic power, but they were in the process actually proving it, because he already did prophesy what they're doing now. Look back in Luke 18. This probably was about a week before. Jesus said to his disciples, we are going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written about the Son of Man by the prophets will be accomplished. For he will be delivered over to the Gentiles and will be mocked and shamefully treated and spit upon. And after flogging him, they will kill him, and on the third day he will rise. Now here's what's happening. Jesus predicted what they're doing. They're saying, prove your power by telling us who hit you. And Jesus has said, I already did that a week ago. I already predicted this a week ago. I predicted this whole scene. They're trying to mock his power and by proving him to be powerless, but they're actually proving his ultimate control. Now even think, why are they mocking him? You see, these are the religious guards. These are the temple guards. These are the religious people who claimed to believe the Old Testament, who talked about the prophets and talked about the Messiah. And you know why they're mocking him? Is they're saying, you can't be a prophet because you have no power. Because prophets, they're somebody with power. They thought of stories like in the Old Testament, Elijah. Elijah called down fire from heaven, and that's power. Or they thought of 2 Kings 2, where some kids started mocking the prophet Elijah and for being bald, and the prophet Elijah called bears out, and they came out and mauled the kids, which just a little warning about anyone thinking of mocking the hairline of your spiritual leader. It's a dangerous thing to do. 2 Kings 2, now I'm not going to call it bears on anybody, but they're looking at it and they're saying that's what prophets do. Prophets have power. And so they're thinking, Jesus, you claim to be a prophet. Where's your power? You can't be a prophet, because if you were a prophet, God wouldn't let these things happen to you. If you were a man of God, you wouldn't be weak. You wouldn't be vulnerable. God doesn't work through weakness and vulnerability. They were looking at the apparent senselessness of Jesus' suffering. They looked at his weakness and vulnerability and they mocked him, because God doesn't work like this. You can't be the Messiah. You can't bring God's work of salvation. But what they missed is that is exactly how God brought salvation. You see, if he said, let me show power and wipe them out, or if he even wiped out the Romans, he might have saved people from bad political leaders, but he wouldn't have saved humanity. It was only in allowing himself to be beaten and crucified that he took the sins of the world upon himself, that he would bring ultimate salvation. Now, as we look at this, though, there's a trap here that we have to realize that we can be vulnerable to as well. And that is that we can look at the tragedy in the world. We can look at bad things that happen and say, a loving and powerful God wouldn't let those things happen. If God was really in charge, evil wouldn't happen like this. The bad things in my life wouldn't happen. How can I believe God? But we need to realize is that this story shows us that God often works in very unexpected ways. God will at times work allowing evil to seem to be in control, when in reality, he's ultimately in charge. That God is sovereignly working out his plan. He did then, and he still does it now. Let me even give you a picture of this. Sometimes you go outside and if you see an incredible storm coming over. I remember we used to live in South Florida, and we would see hurricanes come. And when you would see this big hurricane, it'd be enormous, and everywhere you'd see these dark clouds and the winds and the rain, and it would be overwhelming to the point where, it was dark. Now, the question is even when you have a hurricane that come in, does it affect the sun? Does it change the stars? No, the sun's still out there. You just can't see it. The stars are still out there. The sun continues to shine, and in time the clouds will go away, and we'll be reminded of that. Sometimes you see that if you've ever been in a storm and you take off in an airplane and you take off there and it's dark and it's scary and the winds are there and it's threatening, but then you have the plane break through the clouds and suddenly it's like, where did the storm go? Suddenly the sun is there, and if you look down, you see that, but suddenly you realize the sun was never threatened in the slightest way. And that's what we need to realize, in the same way that we will go through periods where it will look like it's dark, where there's incredible storm clouds, where we don't see the sun shining at all, we don't see God's purpose. And yet we need to realize that the clouds are there, but it hasn't changed the sun at all. The sun is still shining. God is still on the throne. He is still accomplishing his purposes. And in time, the clouds will blow away, and we'll remember that. We need to take hope. We see this in the second picture as well here in the end of Luke, and it's the condemnation of Jesus by the religious leaders. They condemned him because he failed to be the kind of Messiah that they wanted. He failed to meet their expectations. Look at verse 66. When they came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both the chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to the council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." That's the Messiah. And he said to them, "If I tell you will not believe, and if I ask, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And when you look at it, you say, how is God sovereign in this? Here's what's happening. The religious leaders were trying to somehow make their condemnation of Jesus look legitimate. They're trying, in fact, Mark and other Gospels tell us that they even brought in different witnesses to try to condemn Jesus, but the witnesses, their stories didn't match up. And so in sheer desperation, they're trying to trick Jesus into saying something that they could use against him. They've been doing it all week. And basically they're saying, if you're saying the Messiah, then we can go to the Romans saying he wants to be a king and you got to get rid of him. That's what they're trying to do. And they've tried to do it all week and it's failed time and time again. And so finally they're coming and they're saying, okay, well, let's try to do it, this trial, putting it straight out there. And he's saying, if you say the Messiah, we're going to go to the Romans. And Jesus said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask, you will not answer. And basically saying, you're asking if I'm the Messiah, you don't want to know. You're not trying to find out because you want to know truth. You've already decided I'm not, and you're just trying to get me to say something you can use against me. Again, these are the religious leaders who claimed to believe in the Bible, and they claimed they wanted to see the Messiah. Why are they rejecting Jesus? Was it because they studied the Bible and they said he doesn't match up with biblical prophecy? No, he did. They weren't studying the Bible. What was happening is that they were saying, we want a certain kind of Messiah. We want a political Messiah. And you're not the kind of Messiah that we want. It's not that he wasn't the Messiah, the Messiah of the Bible. He wasn't the Messiah of their own making. And so now they're rejecting him. See, now in the same way, I see people do this all the time today. That people will look at it and they reject God, not because the Bible isn't true, but because in their mind it's like if God were true, he would be like this. They have a God not of the Bible, but a God of my own making, a Jesus of my own making. He would do this. He would say this. And then I'm frustrated that he isn't. And people will then try to argue against God or disprove God. People will say, well, I don't believe in God for this reason. I give an answer and it's, well, here's another reason. They don't want to know. They don't want to know. Yeah, they're coming and you're basically saying, here's the conclusion that I have, and I'm trying to just give intellectual cover for my rejection of God's authority in my life. And so that's what we still do. And we've got to say, okay, is that you? And if that is, I'm going to be honest in your pursuit of God. So now I love it, though, in Jesus' response, because here's where you see they're trying to do this. They've rejected him. They're trying to trick him. And Jesus comes back to them and he's saying, I see your trap. I see what you're trying to do, and I'm not going to give you what you want, but I'm going to give you new information. In verse 39, he says, from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. He's saying, you want to know if I'm the Messiah, if I'm the Christ, and then you're going to try to use my answer against me with the Romans. I'm not going to answer that question, but I will tell you that the one who sends the Messiah, the Son of Man, God, I'm him. I'm the one that gave that prophecy. I'm the one who is behind the Messiah. I'm God. I'm going to one-up you on that. And so he's making in this his sovereign control over everything. He's not falling into the trap at all, but he's saying, I'm willingly stepping into this path that I've chosen of my own volition. And here's what we need to realize. There are going to be times that it seems like people are manipulating and things are being tricked, and God is never tricked. God isn't planned. God isn't. When we look at everything that is going wrong here, it's looking like from a human perspective, God can't be in charge. And yet God is in charge, and the greatest event of all human history is working itself out in what appears to be an hour of darkness. And we need to realize that Jesus' life, in a sense, is a sort of mini version of the whole of human history. And if God could take the senseless tragedy of Jesus' death and turn it into something that is cosmically wonderful, do you think that he's going to do that in our lives as well? That he's any less in charge? And so we need to see God's sovereignty and his good plan in the darkness of night. And when it looked so dark that Jesus himself said, this is your hour, the hour of the power of darkness. And if we can believe that God was sovereign there, can you believe that he's sovereign whatever you're going through in your own life? Now let me circle back to one last part of this from an earlier part of the story, in Peter's denial. And there's an incredible truth here in Peter's story we need to see. And that is that we see God's sovereignty not only in the events that are taking place, but I want you to see God's sovereignty even in Peter's failure, even in our failure. Remember, Peter had made these incredible promises about, Jesus, everyone else will deny you, but not me. I'm never going to fail. He was so sure of his strength, of his commitment, but in his pride and self-reliance, at first he followed Jesus when others left, but ultimately the darkness can get so dark that we give up. And I want to tell you, and I hear this, I relate to Peter's failure. And again, it's easy to define this narrowly and to say, well, have I ever denied that I know Jesus? No, I haven't done that. I don't live in an environment where that can cost me my life. You have many people who do live in environments where that's their temptation. Let's define his failure more broadly. You see, his failure wasn't just in denying Jesus. It was in saying in his boast, I would never do that. Others may fall into that sin, but I would never do that. How many of us had said something like that? I would never do that. I would never leave my spouse. I would never give up on my marriage. I would never fall back into that old sin that I was addicted to in the past. I would never have sex outside of marriage. I would never hurt someone the way that they hurt me. I would never turn into that dishonesty. I would never. And what is the I would never that you've said? And for many of us, like Peter, when things then get really hard, when life gets so dark that we don't see God working, we don't feel him answering our prayers, what's tempting to do is then we turn to that sin that we said, I would never do, because we're overwhelmed. And I can understand that. I relate to Peter in that. And if you've been one that has fallen into that sin where you told God, I would never do it, here's the question. How does God look at you now? I want to give you hope from this story. You need to see that God isn't surprised by our failure. Let's go back to the middle of Luke 22 when Jesus was at the Last Supper with his disciples. And again, remember, Peter's making these great boasts. I'm never going to leave you. I will never. And then you see Jesus turn to Peter, and look what Jesus says to him. He says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift each of you like wheat, but I have pleaded in prayer for you, Simon, that your faith should not fail. So when you have repented and turned to me again, strengthen your brothers. He's looking at him and he's saying, okay, Peter, I prayed for you, but I'm going to come back to this, but it's like, I'm praying your faith will not fail, but you're going to fail. And then he predicts the betray, 3 times you're going to deny me, specifically in a couple verses later. And then at the end of the story, if you have your Bibles, look at what happens in verse 60. But Peter said, when he was challenged a 3rd time, man, I don't know what you're talking about. And immediately, while still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, for he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. As soon as he denied him the 3rd time, the rooster crows. He looks at Jesus into his beaten face. And again, the question I asked earlier, what did Peter see in Jesus' face? What did he see in his eyes? Was it anger? Was it disappointment? Was it rejection? Was it, I can't believe you let me down. Peter, I'm suffering here and you can't even stand with me. I can't believe how weak you are. Is that what you saw? What he saw? No. You know what I think he saw? I think he saw, Peter, I told you. I knew you would do this. And I love you. And remember, I told you, come back. See, and this is a vital question, because what happens is that all of us disappoint at some time. All of us have that sin. I would never, and we've done it. And when we ask, what did Peter see in Jesus' eyes? I'm also asking, what do you see in Jesus' eyes? And there are many here that would say, I can't look at his eyes because I fear rejection. I fear disappointment. I fear, God, how God, I trusted you, I did better. And we are afraid to look. And Jesus grabs us and says, no, I want to look. Was Jesus disappointed in Peter? No. Why? What's disappointment? Disappointment is, I expected better, and I can't believe you didn't do as well as I expected. Did Jesus expect better of Peter? No, he expected Peter to fall. Peter was disappointed in Peter. And in the same way, we're disappointed in ourselves, but God isn't disappointed. We fail, and God says instead, I expected better. I can't believe you're weak. God's like, I've seen that weakness in you before. I knew it was there. I've been warning you about it. And now will you agree with me? Now will you surrender? Now will you let me forgive you? Now will you let me give grace? Now will you let me give strength that you don't have? Now will you let me give healing? You see, in Jesus' eyes, there's grace, there's healing, there's understanding. You know, God knows us better than we know ourselves. And not only is there grace, not only is God not surprised, but I want you to see that in this passage, it teaches us that God not only has grace, but there's redemptive purpose even in our failure. That God sits there and looks at Peter and not only would say, I understand, but now turn back and let's go back to what he said. When he said in verse 32, and when he said, you're going to fail me, and when he said, I'm praying for you, and when you have repented and turned back, strengthen your brothers. Now, do you see what Jesus is saying here? He's saying, Peter, you're going to fail, and now I don't want you to come back, but when you come back, now take that and use the story of your failure and use it to strengthen other people. Let me redeem it. Let me take it and use it as a part of your ministry. It's not only that you failed me and I can never use you. No, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to restore you. But I'm going to use you not only in spite of, but because of your failure. I'm going to take that part of your story and I'm going to redeem it. My friends, this is such an incredible part of God's grace that so many of us have a hard time understanding that we need to embrace. So many of us feel like, man, I failed, and like Peter, and I want to go hide. And I want to tell you that God is pursuing and say, I know you. I know your weakness beforehand. I'm not disappointed. I'm not rejecting you. I not only want to forgive you, but I want to redeem it. I want to take that and say, now use that. And you know what we see the story. We talk about all the time that God wants to take our story of failure and shame, and he wants to, by his grace, turn it into a story of his glory. And we've seen that with some of these testimonies of baptisms in the last month or so. We've heard some stories and people have shared things, and you're like, oh, that's terrible. And they're things that we would naturally want to hide. And we've heard that story, and instead of saying, oh, that's terrible, we said, what a great story. It's a terrible me story, but by God's grace, it suddenly becomes a great God story. And many of us have been encouraged and given hope by these stories, these terrible stories that God has redeemed. I want you to realize that even in the mistakes that God is not sovereign or not in charge. He doesn't cause evil. He doesn't cause evil to happen to us. He doesn't, not the source of darkness, but he's sovereign over darkness. He's sovereign. He doesn't cause us to sin. He's sovereign even over our sin. Look what it says in Ephesians. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Do you see what it's saying? He works all things according to the counsel of his will. All things, the good, the bad, the things that are done against us, the dark times, when evil seems to work against us, even when we, like Peter, fail. If we let it, God will take our story of shame and he will make it a story of grace. He will take we said, man, we still wear these scars. God has the ability to take, yes, he leaves the scars of past sin, but he will take that scar and he will transform it into a unique mark of beauty if you let him. Are you willing to let him do that? Are you willing to come and say, God, I want to surrender this. I want to have the courage to come and to look in the eyes of Jesus Christ and to look and see not his rejection, not his disappointment, the things that I fear, but to see his grace, to see his forgiveness, to see even his restoration and his redemptive purpose. God, help me to take all the things that I want to hide and know how you want to not only forgive me, but to redeem me and even to use me. Are you willing to bring that before Christ today? See, I hope that as we look at this whole story, it's a story of darkness. And some of us, you might be in that season where, man, I'm under the cloud and I don't see where God's working. Do you see God as sovereign over all things? Look at the story of Jesus, and if God was sovereign in that, can you believe that he's sovereign in what you face? That the sun is there still above the clouds and the clouds will pass. Or even if that darkness is your own failure in how you have turned or you have failed in those difficult times, I want you to see that God is still even sovereign over that. And don't hide, but bring it before Christ. Look at his eyes and feel not only his grace, but his redemptive power.
If you have a question about the message, Community Church, or Jesus Christ, send us a text to 330-400-3242. You can learn more about our events and community groups at ccpl.life/connect. There you can also send in a prayer request. We would love to pray for you. Have a blessed Lord's Day, and we'll see you on Sunday.